Thank you. I start with presenting some data. This is data from 2 long-term studies. The green line is the longitudinal aging study Amsterdam. That actually this is only aged 75 plus. There's a specific reason for it because we have more data from these people. Community dwelling people, all are, or most of them are Dutch. This program started in 1992 and we follow these people, and what you see is on the right that we have a number of observations available after the outbreak of the pandemic. We have also similar data from longitudinal internet studies, social sciences, the LIST panel. It is an internet study, but similar to the LASA study, it uses sample from the population register. So people who do not have access to internet or are not able to use it are provided with equipment and are trained in it. So they say that that is a reasonable representative sample for the people in the Netherlands. The upper age is 80 there. The upper age in LASA is the oldest is over 100 years old. What you see here is that there's a very clear pattern of an increasing loneliness after the outbreak of the pandemic. This is only for emotional loneliness. For social loneliness, there is an increase and a statistical increase, but the effect size of this increase is so small that I don't want to present it as meaningful. So here the increase is particularly for emotional loneliness. What you also see is that the latest data, actually the latest data from LASA are from February of this year, but the latest data that are on the screen presented they are from fall in last year, and you see that there's a decrease in loneliness at the end of what we hope at the end of the pandemic. The peak is different in the 2 samples, but there is in both samples a very clear peak. By the way, the scale, so the percentage on the left, is not in a similar way constructed in both programs. So you cannot say that in one sample is a higher prevalence found than in the other sample. The LIST sample also provides the possibility to look whether there are age differences, because the youngest respondents in the LIST panel are 16 years. On the right, you see the age distribution and the loneliness across all these years. And what was found is that there is a peak when you analyze all these data. There's a peak in October 2020, so half year after the outbreak of the pandemic. But compared to all the other observations, including the 2021 observation, there is a difference in loneliness, as you can see, for emotional loneliness and for social loneliness, but not related to age differences. So the peak in October 2020 is seen in all age strata when you compare these in a huge multivariate analysis. Well, the third one is not related to the pandemic, but I also present this graph to research, but also to the general public, because it explains in a very brief way what is going on in old age. When you take as a criterion that social isolated means that you're living alone and do not have weekly network contacts, then you see that the percentage of older people that is socially isolated is increasing, but also within that category, the likelihood of being lonely is increasing. As you can see, for example, at the age of 65 and the age of 90, a very clear difference in the likelihood being lonely. By the way, I also looked to the partner status and being isolated in the reactions on the pandemic. But what was striking to me is that the rise of being emotional lonely was seen in all groups, so both in those with a partner and in those without a partner and living alone and without network contacts, daily network contacts. So the pandemic hits everyone in about a similar extent. So we have, of course, to consider that the Dutch lockdown was different from other countries. For example, to the southern countries where it was very strict, but also now, still nowadays, the measures are always stricter. For example, in our neighboring country, Germany, we had recently a very strict lockdown, but the Dutch people are good in avoiding the most severe aspects of it, and for example, there was no problem with going outside, and that's very clearly different to Italy, for example, but also recently to Germany, where people are really expected to stay inside when they are infectious. But in the Netherlands, you can go out, but not see other people. So the idea of being isolated, social isolate, of keeping social distance is different. And also a very important aspect is that we saw in the data that many older people, they were active, but also used communication technology. The use of internet and all social media and other things in the Netherlands is very high, up to very high ages. So that's really an advantage also with other countries. So it was not so much the social embedding that was affected by the crisis, but rather the emptiness and close connectedness with people around them. So they were missing something, and of course, they missed the physical contact itself, but most of them were in contact. By the way, this is among the people who are living independently. The situation for people living in institutions was quite different from those in the communities. I think a very important aspect, what is often overlooked, is the regulative coping. We apply the cognitive discrepancy approach to loneliness. So one of the ways to deal with loneliness is to lower your standards. And well, in many respects, the people living independently, for example, they were able to cope with the situation, but for example, to looking those in nursing homes. Also, their standards about how many contacts you can have in this situation could be lowered. And also, I think it's also important, because we also looked into existential loneliness, which did not increase in the pandemic, that people find meaning in themselves during this period. It is a period of looking to your situation. So you cannot say that's really a positive aspect of the pandemic, but people are really dealing with it. And we also saw in the things that they did, that many people were active in, well, doing something, going out, but also to think about the situation and doing other, say, more introspective things. But what we did not see is, across all the coping things that we measured, we had about 20 things that, when I remember well, in our list, no one was really helping in fighting loneliness. So loneliness was dependent on, partly on the situation as it was before the outbreak of the pandemic, but also the same risk factors. For example, a lack of mastery was one of those aspects, was important both before and during the pandemic. And when there was a lack of mastery, people were more lonely. So what about the categories at risk? I already mentioned mastery, also better physical functioning protected. What we, by the way, rarely see in our data in usual circumstances. So it's not a big issue, I think, as a risk factor for loneliness. Of course, there are specific groups, but in the general population, it's not one of the main factors. What we saw also that was social participation before the pandemic helped to cope with the consequences of it because it provides structurally embedded contexts. Other things, for example, church attendance was one of the facts we looked at, but that was not protective during the pandemic. And it might be, of course, that, well, there were some exceptions, but most of the churches were actually closed for the services, and the services were held online. And what we also saw is that that a large social network and heavy data contact was so that identified less structurally embedded people, but most groups were affected by the pandemic. So what to do? I think that one of the things that we have to consider is that being lonely is quite different from being socially isolated. These are really different concepts. They are, of course, in practice empirically related, but the relation, the association is not very strong. Another thing is that I think that we have to look at prevention. So there should be more emphasis on structural embedding of older peoples. What we know is that incidental social activities in most cases do not help to fight loneliness. For example, organizing meals, that kind of activities. Well, one of my messages is also in reaction to the report is do not overestimate the role of family. For a number of reasons, the family size is of course decreasing. Family members are not always able to visit an older person on a daily basis, and there are sometimes low quality relationships. What we know from our research is that a significant portion of the older adults have, I would say, troubled relationship with one or more of their children and also with other family members. So what we have to do, yeah, that was something that I already said. Another thing is that I think that we could use the people who are already visiting the older people. For example, many older people are using home care that are very short visits, usually, for example, a couple of minutes. But these minutes can be used or can be extended to somewhat more minutes to get an eye of these older people. This is really something that is adopted by the district nurses in the Netherlands as a strategy to fight loneliness, because they often see lonely people and they think that it can help. About the cognitive approach to loneliness, lowering relationships is of course also something dangerous, because when people are lowering these standards, that might make them passive. They might be satisfied with few relationships, and you need relationships to have a good life. And well, actually, I already said it in a comment to Lena, some of these vulnerabilities are difficult to change. So I think the targeted policies can also develop that reduce their negative impacts. Thank you. By the way, some of these things are published in already a year ago. So also covering the beginning of the pandemic, the most recent data are not yet published.